Yes, so I want us to look at post-conflict reconstruction through civil society, and we should remember that when we discuss post-conflict reconstruction, each case will be different. So here, for example, I have 3 photos taken during my travels. Uh, to the left, Kuwait, in the center, Oman, and to the far right, Jordan. These are countries that have experienced conflict in different ways, and they've reacted differently. Their forms of nationalism have been affected by conflict as well. And I'll discuss that as we go along. So for example, the center here, we have the previous Sultan of Oman, Sultan Qaboos, celebrating the National Day, which was his birthday. So we have a highly centralized monarchy that emerged from conflict that Sultan put an end to. And of course, each government or each emerging government will react differently to conflict. So we will discuss the main actors of post-conflict reconstruction, and how important is it to share knowledge and build trust. I think this is going to be the key aspect of this presentation. And certainly from my time in Jordan, I think trust is very, very important. What exactly is capacity building in civil society, and how do we discuss civil society abroad and at home? Does our language about NGOs from our home country differ from language we use when we talk about NGOs operating on foreign soil? I think that will be a very important point to make, because sometimes there's a mismatch. So the first thing I would like to get down to is identity. We discussed this, as you might recall, in our forum. We all have different identities. Some of them are compatible, some of them are more individual. But you'll see from this nice little section here, or this gallery, there's a lot of things we don't get to see about each other. You will see how I dress, you will see how I behave, you will not see my habits, my thinking, my beliefs. All these core values are not necessarily on the surface, and this is important because when you go into, as many of you have, you go into a different country, into a different culture, you will not absorb and understand everything. And this is, I think, a key point when it comes to conflict. Identity can lead to tension. It is often a source of tension that is manipulated by different actors to create conflict. So the question then becomes, as we've discussed before, who benefits from conflict? Let's not forget that often there is a war economy. In a lot of countries that have suffered from conflict, there is a war economy. And as I mentioned a while back now for one of our webinars, when I was at Parliament here in London and we were talking to activists from Sudan, they had been to conferences in their home country where certain generals and militias had said to their faces, you know, peace is expensive. It's a very expensive process, and it's also not necessarily to our benefit. And this is something we have to remember as well. So once a conflict comes to an end, you need to build trust, but you also need stability. And here we have this pressing tug of war: transparency versus certainty. Can a government be highly centralized and still transparent? Can it offer democracy and stability at the same time? So this comes down to also trust building as well. We can talk about anti-corruption trusts, we can talk about freedom of the press, but again, from my experience in the Middle East, the key that a lot of actors push for good and bad is stability. And this is part of the problem as well. How can we stabilize while also promoting a democracy that is appropriate to the culture in question and the cultures? And a lot of this is linked to humanizing those cultures. I'll discuss Oman in a moment as well, because one of the things that happened in Oman from 1954 to 1970, there was a civil war. And one of the first things the Sultan did when he stopped that war, he was 29 years old, one of the first things he did was he deployed the military to help rebuild the nation so that they would become the face of a new Oman. And he visited different towns, different tribes to listen to their concerns. He tried to humanize his people in a way that his predecessor had not. And this is very important, humanizing each other, humanizing other cultures that you go into as well. And I also will talk a bit about the importance of local NGOs, whether or not you should engage with them, how you should engage with them. I worked for a local NGO when I was in the Middle East, and it was a very interesting experience. So in an ideal world, I wish we could see knowledge sharing as a bottom-up process to build trust, because if you go into a country you've never been to and locals can come to you with their concerns, so you actually listen to what they need, that would be very helpful. If locals could then go through a domestic civil society, and from there, the domestic civil society could help regional and international civil society, this would be a wonderful bottom-up process. I remember speaking to a colleague in Pakistan, actually, who looked at working for an NGO in Pakistan. He's originally from Canada with Pakistani roots. And he said, you know, one of the things that I really struggled with is that some of the NGOs I approached, they had no idea how to connect with locals. They wanted to give out iPads to villages, to children in villages. And in these villages, most of the kids can't read. What's the point of giving out an iPad if you're not starting from the basics and you're not listening to what people need in that culture? And I think there's a lot of people who mean well, but who don't pay attention to that. So yes, understanding local needs instead of guessing what people want is very, very important. International NGOs may have a bigger budget, but of course, you can't throw money at the problem. You have to understand what is it the locals want, what do they feel is best, and I do feel that a robust civil society needs to engage locals and to have more of a bottom-up process. And the question then becomes, again, to what extent can you partner with local NGOs should they exist, because they may be better connected to local needs. For good and bad, they may also be more entrenched in certain types of local politics, and I'm going to talk about that as well based on my experiences in the Middle East. So when is an NGO not an NGO? This is a very good question to ask. This is from Amnesty International referring to Egypt. So under Mubarak, NGOs existed, but they were highly depoliticized. They basically existed as charity organizations that were meant to plug welfare gaps. They couldn't get political. And with the NGO that I worked at, there were some similarities. Now this, ladies and gentlemen, is a photo I took. This is the view I had from my office every single day. This is in Amman. It is the Umayyad Palace, one of the oldest ruins in the Arab world. And it was a reminder of, being in Jordan. It was a wonderful time. Amman, the capital, is one of the few places where you will have ruins coexisting with modernity. It's a wonderful place. But at the same time, every single day I walked into my office, every morning, what was the first thing I saw? The first thing I saw was a portrait of the king hanging from the office wall. And I used to sometimes, even my boss would joke with me, are we really an NGO when sort of, the king greets us every morning from the office? Are we really an NGO when we rely on royal patronage? And this is kind of the point here, that there are choices to be made when you go into other countries and how you interact with those countries and the political structure. So when I entered Jordan back in, it was effectively 2012, at a time when the Arab Spring had kind of started to brush Jordan, because of who we were, because of the NGO status in the country, we were granted election observer status during the 2013 parliamentary elections, alongside the UN, by the way. So that was a very interesting experience to see how does Jordan present their elections. And I remember I attended a press conference with my boss, Abdullah Ansor, who was the prime minister at the time. He came to the conference and his finger was marked in black ink to show he'd voted. And then there was a press conference and he answered questions. And then the next person up was the chief of police, which is interesting because it means that some observers were concerned about security. And at the time, the chief of police assured us that the only incident that they had had so far was the wife of one political candidate beating up the wife of another political candidate, and they'd both been to hospital. That was it. But nothing sort of, nothing armed or militarized. So, because of our status as an NGO, we were able to participate in observation. On the other hand, there were some critics, including those on the outside, who said, look, this election, it had a 53% turnout and votes were cast along tribal lines. It wasn't really a democratic vote. And so here we see some of the limitations that there are certain things we could not do as an NGO. There are certain things I tried to push, projects that I wanted to do that you cannot cross certain red lines if you're working for a local NGO. And so at the same time, we had partnerships with Western NGOs as well. One of them, the Tony Blair Foundation, was trying to access Egypt. And so we were giving advice to UK-based NGOs on how could you tap the Egyptian market, if I may use that term. And one of the conversations we had was me, my boss, and another NGO. Because they did not have a regional partner on the ground, they partnered with the Tony Blair Foundation directly. And because of the war in Iraq, that foundation was not very popular in Egypt and across the Arab world, and they didn't know. So, we then assisted them and said, okay, well, we have contacts in Jordan, but also in Egypt. So if you really want to get a project going, we can talk, we can see what we can do together. So, in a sense, from my time in Jordan, when I look at centralized versus less centralized governments, local NGOs like ours, we still have to report to the government. Most monarchies in the Arab world are very centralized. Jordan is no exception. So we would report to the government and we would get a budget for certain projects from the government. At the same time, we would network with regional and international NGOs, and they also came to us. They came to us because we knew Jordan in a way that they did not. Some of them, Jordan was new, the Middle East may not have been, but we knew people. We knew regional networkers, we knew figureheads, we knew politicians, etc., etc. We used to have weekly meetings with members of the Jordanian armed forces who were trying to continue certain projects to help locals and whatnot. And also we had access to refugee camps and stuff like that. So we found ourselves helping regional and international NGOs, but they would still have to go through the government, and so did we. And I can imagine in a situation where you have a provisional government, and I'll talk a bit more about this in a second, local NGOs, if they have existed before the conflict, during and after, they may have more knowledge than the provisional government. And I can imagine that a lot of actors would actually come to them. And this is both a good thing and a bad thing, because under the current circumstances, COVID-19 and others, you would see NGOs that are meant to plug gaps. If they do too good a job with certain governments, there's going to be competition. And this is one of the things that happened actually in Egypt. I remember when I visited Egypt, I interviewed a few people. They said that one of the reasons certain NGOs were shut down was because when they started to plug welfare gaps and talk politics, and they did a better job responding to certain situations than the government did, basically the government looked bad. So that was a problem, In terms of capacity building as well, what do we mean by capacity building? What should that entail? Should it entail democracy? What does that mean as well? Does capacity building have to mean democratic transition? And I think this is a point, because there's a lot of people who get involved in NGOs from the Western perspective and who genuinely want to help, but they may only have one or two perspectives. Here we have a photo of the Libyan 1 dinar that came after Gaddafi's overthrow. And I remember when I used to go to downtown Amman, they would sell banknotes from the Arab world, and slowly the former banknotes from Libya, they stopped coming, the ones that had Gaddafi's face on them, and they were replaced with, among others, this note. This is the Libyan flag that was chosen after Gaddafi's downfall, surrounded by doves, to symbolize peace and to symbolize the notion of transition. But as we all know, Libya has not been a model of democratic state building. And a lot of people would argue that that is not the fault of the people, it is the fault of those who bombed them, it is the fault of those who intervened. So again, we come back to the same idea of, democratic transition is a very loaded term. Should capacity building involve that, or should it involve other aspects such as security? And how do NGOs get involved in that? I think that for capacity building, we need a balanced approach. You can't have lasting democracy without security. If you have security and no democracy, you can slide back into dictatorship. And when it comes to war crimes, because there will be issues of justice, if you don't have security and democracy in place first, how can you have justice? Justice should not be about revenge. It should be about harmony, acknowledging the wrong that has been done and allowing people to heal, having punishment for those who participated, but it should not mean the participation of militias. It should not be about revenge killings and so on and so forth. So we see how complex capacity building is, that perhaps certain things need to go hand in hand, and they cannot be done one at a time. And I think that was a mistake in Libya, that people kept talking about democracy and pushing it, and it really didn't work because it did not take into account tribal lines, especially also in Iraq, by the way. One of the things that dictators have done is that often they have suppressed the organic political evolution of their states. So Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, they would pay tribes for loyalty, and they would also suppress their influence in countries where perhaps tribes should have influence, because it is a part of the culture. And if you don't take that into account, you're not going to be able to have proper capacity building. And here, I'd like to take a moment to discuss coronavirus. I mean, let's face it, it's all we're talking about, it's all we're reading about. Jordan, up until recently, has actually been a very good case study because their numbers have been low. But one of the things that I've been looking at as a political analyst is, how will the government spin the approach to the coronavirus? To the top right, we have a very recent photo of Abdullah II, the current king of Jordan, giving a speech about the coronavirus. Now, normally, when he addresses the nation, he's wearing a suit with a red tie. Not here. He's wearing a military uniform, and that was intentional. The message he's saying is, this is war. This is a war against an unseen enemy. And one of the things that I'm looking at is, will coronavirus end up being used as an excuse for increasing authoritarianism? You know, strict lockdowns, strict curfews, but what happens afterwards? And at the same time, a country like Jordan that has had more than one brush with the Arab Spring, how will someone like the current king play around with that idea and basically say, you know, our numbers are some of the lowest in the Middle East, which they are. We saved our people. You know, we may not be able to give you jobs, we may not be able to give you employment or aid, but we made sure that you didn't die. And I bet you some of these guys are going to play around with that idea. To the bottom right, we have the new Sultan of Oman, Haytham bin Tariq, who was chosen in January. So Sultan Qaboos, the previous ruler, he died at the age of 79, I believe, in January. And he wrote Haytham's name in a sealed envelope. So suddenly this guy woke up and he was chosen, he was Sultan. That was in January. Now, you know, by March, the coronavirus had spread into Oman. So again, this is a country that has seen war and that was built, modern Oman was built on a civil war that the previous Sultan was able to end through amnesty and by using religion to paint rebels as un-Islamic in a country that is deeply religious. So the question for me becomes, will COVID-19 be the new enemy? Will someone like Sultan Haytham use COVID-19 as a new enemy to kind of get around the fact that there's rising unemployment, falling oil prices, and so on and so forth? And this is part of the issue as well. We go back to the three steps I showed you, or three circles: democracy, security, and justice. I'm expecting that in some countries, that security circle is going to go bigger and bigger. And it may not necessarily be for the right reasons. So, you know, how is the coronavirus crisis feeding into manipulation of security and affecting capacity building? How will it affect the relationship between governments and civil society, especially if you have civil society on the ground that does a better job delivering masks or ventilators than the government does? You know, if you were to have that scenario, that could be a problem for the government's image. And I want to finally discuss the language of civil society, and not just civil society. I want to discuss how we talk about other cultures. I think this is very important. We have various terms for civil society in different languages: NGO, nonprofit, charity. And where we're from, our own culture, our own language could influence how we discuss civil society. You know, so for example, in Arabic, the word for civil society is Jama'iyat Ghair Hakumiyya, which means an organization separate from the government. Now, that is not the same, because, you know, think about it: NGO, non-governmental organization, versus an organization separate from the government. The word separate is stronger, and it does make me ask questions about trust. In the Middle East, NGOs have not necessarily been NGOs, but those that have may have been seen as more politicized, yet also not a part of the government's game. Because this is part of the issue as well in the Middle East, you know, the question of to what extent do people trust their governments? And this varies from country to country. You know, it's all, to me, it's all about trust. And I would like to explore during the Q&A after this presentation. You're all a very international bunch of students, of people, you've all been in the field. And I'm curious, in your own languages, how would you discuss civil society? Do you have specific terms in Italian or Urdu that you would have to explain in English, you know? And also the building of post-conflict zones, the reconstruction, values change. Going back to identity, values can change. Here, this is a photo I took during my travels to Lebanon and Beirut. This is by Martyrs Square. This statue has bullet holes in it. Now, when it was first constructed, it was actually constructed to commemorate the execution of rebels who stood up against the Ottoman Empire. And we also actually have a very similar statue in Syria, in Damascus. However, when the Civil War started from 1975 to 1990, this statue lost the artist's original meaning, and instead it became seen or used as a demarcation line, that from this statue onwards, this is how the city split into different sects. So suddenly the value of the statue changed, its meaning changed, but it's also a reminder of war. Just because you've entered officially a post-conflict phase does not mean that scars just heal. And I think that's very important. When you're going to have sustainable peace, you have to engage everyone, including militias, including actors that you may not like. This is what you're going to have to do. And when we discuss conflict and post-conflict zones, I think that language, including subconscious language, is very, very important. I have here a couple of statements. Yemen is unsafe or Yemen is unstable. I think many people would agree with that statement. However, a lot of people who are not in our field They turn on CNN, they see a story about Yemen, and they think the Middle East is all like that. The Middle East is totally unstable, totally unsafe. And I think this is an ongoing problem. I have a friend of mine who he's Arab, but he grew up in the States. And when he was going to move to Jordan, he was worried about safety. And then when he got there, he thought to himself, I don't know what I was worried about. So our perception of cultures is increasingly, I think, at play, and it will affect you, especially when you're working in the NGO sector. We have to remember, what perception do we have? So again, the language we use about our own domestic NGOs versus other civil societies, those that are abroad. Do we see civil societies that have a lower budget as somehow not being as good as our own? Do we see civil societies that do not promote themselves through English as somehow, that there's a gap? And why is that the case? Again, when I worked for my NGO in Jordan, we had a lot of engagement with actors, but we knew them and they knew us, and they were very happy with what we did. We promoted interfaith harmony. So the idea of Christians and Muslims coexisting peacefully, which in Jordan, I have to say, it is quite true. Religion is not as politicized as it would be in Egypt, but at the same time, this kind of speech, or this kind of work, I'm sorry, had some red lines. It's a very good topic to take on if you want to be balanced and if you want the government to be happy with your work. When we were having an event at the Dead Sea and we were going to talk about the conflict in Syria, I was a speechwriter. I wanted to talk about the refugee crisis, and I was told to tone down the language because they said, oh, we can't be too direct about this here. So again, there are certain red lines, and this is the, I call it the civil society dilemma. The more you engage local NGOs, the more access you can get to the people, but the less political you might be able to be. And that could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing, So language matters, our perception matters, but we also have to acknowledge that gap as well. So that's all from myself, but I'd love to hear from all of you and to take your questions as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nikolai, especially for the focus on identity and language, which I think are really relevant for post-stabilization purposes. Before we dive into the questions, I want just to say hi to Ethan for joining us today. So he's facilitating, as you know, this week. Hi, Ethan.
Hi.
Good to have you.
Hi, everybody.
Thanks for joining.
Yeah. So the floor is yours. It's now open to questions. Just share your views and let us know.
Yep. Anybody?
When we speak about local NGOs, well, I'm a little bit confused because, of course, you were not a citizen of Jordan, but you were working for a local NGO. I'm probably not getting what exactly is the meaning of local NGO, because when I say local, I mean local in the sense of directed with people from the same village where the local NGO.
When I say local NGO, just to clarify, what I mean is, in this case, being located in Jordan, being owned by Jordanians. I was one of other workers who came from different countries that, there was no issue with paperwork. We could go ahead and start working. But the point is, a local NGO would be a domestic NGO in that country. And because they are led by people from the same country, so my boss, as I said, was Jordanian, they would have access to contacts in country that, you may not have if you don't come from that country or didn't grow up there. And this is part of it. A lot of it is networking, to be frank with you. Like local NGOs, they know how to network. They are part of a network because they are so closely linked to the government. And this goes back to my point about, whether or not we were actually an NGO. I'm glad my boss isn't listening in, by the way, but whether or not we were actually an NGO, what kind of government links we had. So, working for a local NGO means a domestic NGO in this case. And we were located in Amman, in the capital. The focus was interfaith harmony. That was the sort of the selling point. And we had various projects, including one that was greenlit by the UN, by the way, called the Amman Message, which basically is to have a day celebrating interfaith harmony, harmony between religions. So this is what is meant by local NGO.
Okay, that's clear.
Yeah.
And now I know that there is the UNOCHA entity that usually tries and coordinate all the efforts between local NGOs and international NGOs, and more in general, coordinate all the organizations on the field. Does this kind of organization work? I mean, I'm afraid that there is like how can I say, an overspending of resources on certain aspects, but the complete lack of resources on others. Is that what exactly happens?
That is actually a very good point, because I suppose, going back to what I was discussing, in my opinion, from my experiences, local NGOs may have more contacts and more access to people, but that doesn't mean that they can automatically be a magic pill that helps everyone. This does not necessarily happen, and part of it, to be frank with you, is the politics. I remember that we had a conference that we held or participated in at the military academy in a town called Zar'a. Zar'a is next to Amman, and it's also very conservative. So I remember we went there, and we were with the US Armed Forces and the Jordanian Armed Forces, and I was asking myself at one point, how does this conference help locals? And to be honest with you, I don't think that it did. This conference was really about regime security. Having a public show of US Armed Forces with Jordanian Armed Forces sends a message that Jordan is a major US ally and has protection. And this is why, again, I come back to this point of, are you really an NGO? NGOs, I think a lot of people may agree that NGOs are meant to be civil society, that is to say, they help locals, they help people, they help refugees. We did have some of that, but also our organization acted something as a mediator for bigger players. I had dinner we had a U.S. colonel, and my boss, a U.S. colonel, and others who were talking about, every year they have a military exercise called Eager Lion, which involves the royal family. Yeah, you've heard of it. Now, I was having a chat over dinner with some friendly gentlemen from the U.S. Armed Forces who were talking about the possibility that they might relocate that exercise to Qatar in the Gulf. And my boss was trying to convince him not to do that. Why? Because, of course, that would mean that Jordan loses out. It's a very prestigious exercise, but it's also political. And this is the difference, that NGOs are meant to be apolitical, and they cannot cross certain lines in the Middle East. But when it comes to being pro-government, they are very political. And so, this is the way it is. But go on, sorry.
How can you not be? So
yeah,
exactly. At least in a minimal part, you have to be politically.
Exactly. And so, but being on the inside gives you exposure to that, so at least you understand what is the connection between the NGOs on the ground versus the government, and how does that affect regional and international NGOs. Now, if an international NGO comes along and doesn't have a network or contacts, then yes, we may be able to help, and it may also be a sincere project. I mean, we had a lot of good projects on the ground, but you also get dragged into the politics of the government, and some of that is very benign. Interfaith harmony, I mean, it sounds fantastic on paper. It's true, but it means that you are more likely to get funding because you're doing something that the government's already talking about. This is an image that they want. Jordan has always sold this image of being an oasis an oasis of stability in an unstable region. So any NGO that taps into that is going to get funding, the fact of life within that framework, So my time in Jordan taught me a lot about the local politics, and this is exactly what I wanted. There's nothing wrong with wanting to help. We all should, but I think that when you understand the inner workings, it also helps you to be aware of how regimes function, and also to be aware of how the culture functions, because the two are not always hand in hand. So I think this is very, very important to remember. And I think that living in Jordan, my time there gave me a lot of exposure to locals as well. And that was very important, because there's a lot of educated Jordanians, and you'll meet a whole bunch of them, but not all of them support the government, and some of them do. And it really varies. So, you get a mix of impressions,
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Any other question?
Hi, I want to piggyback off of Salvatore, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm going to actually read you two quotes, one from an op-ed from DevX from this week, and also one from the reading for this week. And I would hope that you would comment on how they interrelate. So from DevX, many international agencies will this is regarding humanitarian aid in relation to COVID. Yep. So many international agencies will consciously seek local agencies to carry out critical activities, and many INGOs will finally pay extra attention to the importance of nationalizing and localizing interventions. That's regarding the state of humanitarianism moving forward. And from the reading for this week, quote, on the other hand, in the aftermath of a conflict, it may be difficult to know who are the most credible, representative, and legitimate internal actors. And that's regarding choosing the internal actors after a conflict. So I see this as almost like a conflict of interest in some ways when you're post-conflict trying to find out who are going to be the NGOs and how are you vetting them, which is something Salvatore brought up in the conversation in the posts, and hoping that you can comment on that.
Absolutely. I think that's actually a very complex and perhaps frustrating issue, but it's a very good point. I mean, look, imagine, I'll give you an example which links to that. In the 70s in Jordan, there was effectively a civil war where you had Palestinian militias who were tolerated, and they created a state within a state. Now, what they did is what a lot of civil society sectors do. They got support through providing homeless shelters, free education, free food, and look, so imagine if they have more infrastructure than the government, and they have more access to refugee camps than the government, and you come along as an international NGO, and you're like, okay, so who do we work with? The government can't go into these camps. These guys can, and so you would have militias who would set up their own movements, and they wouldn't call themselves NGOs, but they would basically have, you have a militia, it has a command structure, and then at some point there's a wing of that militia with another name, and all they focus on is welfare, education, providing food. That is part of the problem. Is, do you risk collaborating with the wrong people? And things are never clear cut. Whether it's the Middle East or anywhere else, things are never black and white. And I think I really learned that from my time in the Middle East. So I think that you have to be careful, but sometimes, what can you do? If you were in that situation, would you have said, okay, we're going to work with these guys, even though we're aware who they are and that they are not popular with the government, we'll work with them so we can access the kids, we can access the refugees? Or are you going to say, no, we're not going to do this, let's wait until the conflict has been resolved and we'll move on to somewhere else,
I feel like it plays really into do no harm. And that, it's such a fine line, and how often do you know whether or not to roll the dice is kind of, it fills me with apprehension almost.
I think that's all, again, Giacomo, that's a very good point, and it's also about how you are perceived, coming from the outside. All of us, I think, we all want to help others, but also how are we perceived as actors? I mean, going back to the meeting I had with this colonel regarding Qatar and Jordan, I remember he was saying to me and to my boss, he said, I'm from the U.S. Armed Forces, my first time in Jordan, I've received cultural training, and he said, but the problem is when we deployed to Iraq, after the 2003 invasion, if myself or any of my men commit a social faux pas, genuinely accident, some people assume we did it on purpose, because there's now a legacy that has been left from this invasion that I cannot wash off, even though I had nothing personally to do with it. So we have that stigma as well. So it works both ways, that you come as an NGO and say, should I work with these individuals or with these actors? But then the local community may also say, do we want these people to be here? Do we trust them?
I'm also thinking, Nikolai, picking up on everybody's points, and more specifically on the do no harm. What is the time period we are considering? So when we are looking at post-stabilization and we are deciding, and it's an abstract entity, to whom we collaborate with for post-stabilization purposes, would what you mentioned about, okay, but these guys are the ones that have access, so maybe we could focus on that for now, this is the way to go, and the conflict did not end necessarily, so it's still ongoing. But then what will be the status of these militia, as the example you used, and will this serve a post-stabilization end in the long term? So it came to my mind that is also something you have to consider, and I imagine is at sometimes at the bottom of some flawed strategies, or because it's not, maybe in the short period you're doing what you should in terms of access and offering support, but then it doesn't necessarily serve the post-stabilization in the long term.
No, but what it might, no, that's a very good point. What it might do is it may not stop the bleeding, but it may slow it. What I mean by that statement is, for example, if you are an international NGO, there's a huge difference between providing money versus providing strictly food, medicine. I mean, what could the bad guys, if I use that term, do with medicine? Except for, of course, sell it on the black market, but they would not be able to harm people with it. So perhaps one approach would be to say we need to find out who is on the ground, but also in order to maximize this idea of do no harm, we have to be very careful with what we provide. This is where money becomes an issue because once funds are in a bank account, can you keep a check on how they're being used? This is an issue. I mean, that's one of the biggest problems. So I think that would be one way of approaching it. And I'm sure that this is what most NGOs try to do, but nothing's ideal. Of course, because you may say, well, if we could fund these individuals, we know that the food that we're providing, which has to be imported, costs X amount per month. If we could give them the funding to build a canteen or to build this and this, we would actually have a longer term solution. But then again, how will the funds be used? I think that's also part of the issue as well.
Any other points, questions, ideas, even reflections, challenges that come to your mind in terms of the actors interacting in this post-conflict stabilization settings that, or worry you in light of the COVID-19, set of challenges that will be imposed in countries which still face, infant stabilization standpoints, or I don't know, just curious to hear too, and not necessarily questions.
Okay, final statement from me, I promise.
But please go ahead. It doesn't have to be the final one.
Well, I found it great that Nikolai said that it's such a gray area, because one of the parts of the reading that I found to be very strange, I guess, for lack of a better term, but like after the Brahimi report, the idea that they actually almost created like a cut and dry, this is what peace building needs to be, bullet pointed way of doing things seemed very strange to me as I was reading it, because every single different conflict or anything of where peace building or peacekeeping needed to be put into place is going to be subjective. So to have almost a template seems really hard to be able to follow.
No, I think that's another excellent point. I mean, there is no template for peace building. I think it's very, I don't want to just say it's country specific. It's more precise than that. It is culture specific. Bearing in mind that you can have divisions of identity in the same country along language, tribal lines, religion, and this is something we have to bear in mind, because of course these may be aspects that cause conflict in the first place. So what if you have access to a particular part of the country and you can only get in through a particular actor, and that actor is seen as hated by other tribes or by other, sort of, then you get dragged into the politics, and this is going to be a problem as well. There is no clear-cut solution, but I dare say, we all try our best. We all are involved in this field because we care about humanity, and we try to understand how we can build trust in other cultures and how we can just try to make the world a better place,
Thank you. And I also have one question, and I'm thinking about you, Salvatore, more specifically, and picking up on your point, Nikolai, we actually discussed this a lot as the facilitating team pre-course. So the impact of COVID and the language that is used to refer to it as a war, and use of military terminology, and also exteriorizations of this, namely by some officials wearing, uniforms, military uniforms. So I'm wondering, and it's for everybody, do you think, and again, Giacomo, I'm picking up also on your point about the clear cut, and I think that's why, the reading was also proposed to foment this critical analysis. Do you think that COVID-19 and what it will bring will foster that, clear cut approach to what it should be, how it should be devised? The first question would then be, do you consider you can use military terminology to refer to it because of its characteristics and the approach that should be adopted? And the second one is that if yes, do you think that it will lead to this, you know, unified, clear-cut definition of peacemaking procedures?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone wants to go first or if I should.
Yeah.
We have taken as an example the King of Jordan, but we also have another person who was speaking about COVID-19 in a very military terms. I personally think that there is a pretty big difference between a military war situation and COVID-19, and I totally agree with Nikolai when he says that I think it's a stance that some of the leaders, national leaders, are taking only to reinforce their position, only to reinforce their authoritarian and or autocratic in some cases position. My personal opinion, of course.
Well, if I may add to that, actually, I certainly agree, but I would also say on top of that, I am curious whether leaders have to be very careful with that language if they are not able to contain COVID. Because, you know, yes, you could say that the most basic element here is to say it's a threat. You know, it's a threat, therefore it's a war. That's fine. And Jordan's numbers are low, but imagine if Jordan had the UK's numbers, 30,000 people infected, or, you know, hundreds of thousands rather, and tens of thousands of deaths. If you then have a king who goes on TV with a military uniform and says, you know, we're at war, we're going to look after our people, they may be seen as very incompetent, so it may actually backfire. So here we have this balancing act, and I think that for authoritarians, what's happened with COVID-19, they know that it cannot continue for too long, because although it may shore up the status quo, certainly in a place like Jordan, if there's too much unemployment and the whole economy stops, where's Jordan going to get its aid from? I mean, you know, there's that aspect. It's a double-edged sword that it will give them some increasing legitimacy, and it also puts the brakes on other issues. So people cannot protest about unemployment or job losses in Jordan right now, because if you go out, you could die. And so that kind of puts the brakes on that. However, as the longer COVID continues and the more the world economy suffers a recession, the greater the threat becomes that it actually turns from a distraction into a serious problem. And someone like a king who dresses in a military uniform, if he were to continue that rhetoric without being able to manage the numbers, then that would be a problem. I mean, you know, Jordan was very close to having almost zero cases coming up, and all it took was one guy coming from Saudi Arabia. He was a truck driver, came in, he's Jordanian, and he moved into an area called Mafraq, which is where he lives. He tested negative at the border. He then hosted a dinner party, and then 2 weeks later he tested positive. Now we're back to, I think, 30 cases, new cases, because of one individual. And I think Jordan, they really jumped the gun. They strictly enforced more curfews, and they're talking about increasing testing, not just because they don't want it to spread, but because obviously if they cannot control it, all of this warlike rhetoric is going to backfire.
Any other reflections on this potential link? Anyone? Because I was also going to add, is not, and of course, Salvatore, you're right, you know, we know there are other leaders talking about this and many other things we sometimes cannot even incorporate, let's say, for lack of a better word. But I was thinking that, for instance, here in Portugal, and I'm talking about this specific context, I'm not sure, I think there was the mention to war at the political level. I mean, not in the sense that it was a, you know, a prepared speech. I don't recall our president using that word, but at the governmental level it was used. But what I think it's surprising is that media and news broadcasting and people, when you go to the supermarket, they will say, but this is a war. It's a terminology that end up being adopted and with references. So, but it's even worse because we don't know the enemy. So it definitely makes me think about the overall idea and the fact that even in democratic countries as Portugal is, in fact, we had the experience from Italy, of course, and Spain, where a lot of people were dying. So it was, it was the government say, now we have a curfew, and we didn't actually have a curfew, but, limitation measures, and everybody accepted. There was no social upheaval or people complaining about it, because of course we had our neighbors suffering so much. But the fact that people refer to it and incorporated it made me think, because I heard it, several times in news broadcasting, but also when I go to the supermarket once in 2 weeks or something like that. So I'm wondering if this is also something that you hear in your contexts, or if this will be even more used when you're, in fragile situations, or when you're going through stabilization processes and things are still not well achieved or defined, and the impact it might have. But it's just from my context, it's widely used, that heavy military. Yes, Farzana?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Sure.
I'm having some throat problem. No, thank you so much. It's really delighting and very important discussion. Thank you so much for that. And I have just 2 comments, because according to my understanding, why people are acting and reacting like this, or maybe they don't feel bad about these words. We are talking about war or attack, or because it's very certain, first of all. And people are really, it's this like unpredictable situation. First of all, they thought it's like just something normal, or maybe it's a little bit, but now people are really scared. The community that I move in and I talk to people, they come outside, even though I can talk about Georgia, USA. This state has announced as a first governor that, we are going to open everything and life back to normal. The life is not normal. Nobody has opened anything. So this shows announcement didn't make any difference. Even the President Trump here announced that I leave it to the states. All states can decide on their own. But the states decided, and Georgia took the lead. And again, the moment Georgian governor announced the opening the life back to normal, Trump himself started criticizing him that it's too early. I didn't mean that you should announce it today. So my point is that nobody wants to take the responsibility, which is really a big concern right now. That they say things and they go back and they take back their words, and they are not willing to take the responsibility. So people are thinking now the lack of trust has come between people and governments and the authorities, that they are saying, and let's take back their words, and who's responsible. So they are taking their own decisions that no, we are not opening it. So that's how the businesses are not opening, and we are at the standstill situation. And if somebody opens, people are not cooperating. So I think this is certain confusing. Nobody knows whose authority, what authorities can do for us or what they cannot do for us. So that is like right now, like ambiguous situation here. So not here, all over the world. Even I hear back from Pakistan, same thing. Today we have a lockdown. Prime Minister says we don't have a lockdown, but still people are in lockdown. So it's all confusing everywhere. Second, I was talking about, Nikolai talked about NGOs and civil society's perceptions. The perception I have grew up with in Pakistan, that civil society and NGOs, they are the agents of foreign donors or international community. That's the very bad and strong word, agent. Or maybe, these special groups follow Western agenda, right? That's the another blame that you have on NGOs. And neutrality and impartiality is very important. I'm sorry for my kids' voices, so they are there. So it's like this impartiality and neutrality is not there. As Nikolai has said, that his boss, they have political links and politically, well connected. So why NGOs are political well connected? To stay in business, for a long time in that country, because the conflict between NGOs or civil society and between governments will not allow them to survive for a long time. So they have to have those relationships to survive within the country. Some NGOs have the political government's relationship. Some NGOs have very strong relations with the military establishment in the country to survive. So they see who is more powerful in that. So this is what I have experienced. And the third main power and stakeholder is international donors, international community who are supporting them. So that's how military establishment, if the military is strong in that country. Second, political and civilian establishment. And third one is international. So these three stakeholders are, if they are backing that NGO is in business. Otherwise, they're out of business. Without funding, without support, like physical support that they have there. So I think it's the war, again, the word war, for their own survival. The NGOs are, they have no other choice, but there are some NGOs or civil society, they are really doing a great work, keeping their neutrality and impartiality in place, and serving the people, and they have really direct connections. And I understand, as Nicholas said, that one of the Pakistani NGO person was saying that people are taking what acceptability we have at the local level. But I can share with you one thing as an experience with everyone that I've been sharing earlier as well, that my point of view is that we have to introduce the new technology to the poorest of the poor as well. But to them, technology to them, not I'm showing them the technology. Like the bank cards that we introduced all over Pakistan, and of course I was like opposed very badly all over the country by the politicians, I'm saying, not by the public. But because what is she talking about? She is introducing the bank cards to those women who are not educated. They know what is ATM machine. They don't know what is bank because they haven't seen banks from out inside. So she is trying to do something to impress someone, but I have heard a lot. But in 5 years, whatever I did, today it has been proved that in financial inclusion, in mobile banking and branchless banking, now Pakistan is leading in South Asia. So I think you have to take some strong steps like that. There's a lot of criticism around, but these are unconventional steps. So I'm just sharing my experience with you that it's not easy to introduce something unconventional. Of course, there are a lot of people against you, and they are conventional people, and they would love to you follow the path, whatever they have been following from the past as well. I'm sorry, I've taken a lot of your time, but it's like especially for NGOs, I really it's not a good experience. So my question coming out from my all comments is, how can we keep these NGOs or civil society impartial or neutral without the influence of the local political leadership or the political system and the international influence or agenda? For example, if somebody wants step A, B, C in that country, so how can that NGO be impartial and neutral and get the funds as well? So is it a possible solution that I'm talking about?
Well, if I may, building on a couple of your points, firstly, I think that there's a difference between if you come from the culture you're talking about and you introduce a concept that others are saying it's not going to work, you may be more than aware of the political dynamics happening that oppose you, more so than someone who comes from the outside. I think there'll be a difference there. So this, it's worth bearing in mind that if you know the culture, because it is also your own culture, you may know that, no, this is going to work. At the same time, I think that for international NGOs to be impartial and to build trust, one of the things I've noticed, I've had meetings with certain NGOs in London that I will not name, and they want to help. They want to help people in the Middle East. They want to help people in Syria. And I'm sitting in these meetings and I'm looking at people educated at Oxford, Cambridge, the States, and I'm saying to myself, none of the individuals who are taking the major decisions come from the cultures they want to help. And I think what I'm getting at here is perhaps part of it can also be if you invest in the people who are already on the ground, who know that culture and who are a part of it, that can build trust, because then you show that it's not just that we're coming from the outside. There are there's a certain reputation associated with us, you know, as you mentioned, but we genuinely want to help, and we want to understand what the underground issues are. And that is why we also want to hire people from these places to be part of our team, not just as a gesture, but genuinely hire them, train them as NGO workers to help the places that they come from. You know, going back to your point about a reputation, I mean, you know, the Tony Blair Foundation, they had a serious issue in Egypt because, you know, the moment you mention Tony Blair in the Middle East, the first thing they think is Iraq and the war, and they think, you know, this foundation carries the name of someone who we don't like, we don't trust them, we're not going to deal with them. And doors were literally shut in people's faces because of it. So I think that that's another issue. Understanding what image do you have, what legacy is circulating around the NGOs that incorporate a particular person's name or have an association with a certain government. You have to look at it from the other perspective as well. So a politician who is seen as a hero in his or her home country may not be seen as such because of their foreign policy abroad. And we have to acknowledge this, and we have to ensure that we create a balanced reputation and also incorporate people on the ground from these cultures as part of an international team that basically genuinely cares about helping on the terms of those individuals we want to help. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzana, for the interesting questions, and do not worry about taking the floor. It's always good to learn about, you know, each and everybody's context. Are there any other points from
Do we have time for more?
We have it scheduled generally for 1 hour and a half, but if Nikolai is available, I am available.
Okay, one more thing then. So going back to COVID for a second, you know, COVID and the the idea that politicizing it as a war, it just brought to mind some reading from The Roots of Behavior in War from the ICRC, and it was just, you know, they have bullet points on what calling something a war, what it does psychosocially to the population, especially coming from leaders. So, you know, things like, you know, we don't want to have a war. The adverse party alone is responsible for the war. You know, demonizing the other and creating it, giving it a persona almost. I think what it does, at least in the short and medium term, it definitely, no matter what happens economically to a country, it at least brings about some sort of nationalism that, whether you consider it, you know, detrimental to the total of the whole of the country is one thing, but it definitely, I think it brings this whole, well, whatever happens, it's us against them, which I think is personally detrimental, but it is something that I think that a politician can definitely use as a weapon.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it's not just that. I mean, we're talking about COVID-19 in this context, Giacomo, but I think in a larger context, you've hit the nail on the head when you said opposition, us versus them. IFA just finished, I'm starting a series of lectures on the Middle East that I've given at Kingston University. And one of the points I made is that nationalism in the Middle East often is defined through us versus them. And this is especially true of nations coming out of conflict. So it's not just about COVID-19, but when you have nationalism that is aggressive, where it says, you know, we have to win this war, we're right, they're wrong, that creates a problem because it leaves, in a sense, a scar on a nation trying to recover. In Jordan, again, you know, my favorite example, Jordan was a country that was founded through opposition against the Ottoman Empire. And after that, we then saw opposition to other groups, including within the country. During the Arab Spring, we saw that some language actually targeted Palestinians. So you have Jordanian citizens of Palestinian origin. Some of them were framed as wanting to overthrow the monarchy. So suddenly we saw sort of the back to the basics of us versus them. And I think that the problem with this mode of behavior is that it is very, very effective in scaring people. And that's the point. Governments want to scare you, so you rally around them, not because they're democratic, but because you believe that they can protect you. And this is how a lot of non-democratic regimes operate, especially during times of crisis. There's a reason that dictatorship is often preceded by an economic downturn in many, many countries, because people get scared and they're like, okay, just give us something, anything to unite us. And they will turn to anyone who sort of promises what they want to hear. And they may not necessarily think about the fact that the very thing that they fear, this opposition, may have been constructed by the very person trying to gain power, you know.
That's very interesting, because on the other way around, it also, for instance, if you're looking at Portugal, with, again, we have a democratic system since 1974, so we had a really long dictatorship so far, but we, you know, you might be familiar with our, you know, process and revolution, which was very peaceful, you know, no one got killed, and you know there was a huge support from the population. Yeah, and now we have a democratic system in place, and I would say a solid one. And what this did was to bring a level of consensus among different political parties and orientations, so left, right, for this thing said or defined as common good, our common health, and also mobilization around the importance of public systems. And this is something that I think might have impact on the way then actors unfold and the support they have, and linking with your ideas again of, you know, the tides that you might see in with the governments of NGOs, or if we use other terminology in different countries, with all this. But indeed, it's something that it concerns me a lot, because at the same time, you also build this idea around something that you have to fight and we have to sacrifice for now, even within a democratic system, but through this terminology. But what about now, as you say, Nikolai, when things, you know, when jobs that were lost but will now have effects in a multitude of things for our society, and all the hardship will indeed, you know, start to be super evident. And my question for all you is also, is the COVID-19 a potential trigger of conflict? Even in countries who are not at war or nothing similar, but I mean, you know, conflict understood as also as some level of social upheaval and faction approaches. What do you think? I'm thinking about the US, which concerns me a lot because of what you said, Farzana, and the different, you know, these things left to be decided on specific states and very different situations and some levels of inequality. I'm wondering what effect this might have in terms of political decisions, so when the voting phase comes, but also if it will lead to more division and to a through conflict. I mean, with increased levels of violence, particularly in countries as the US, in which, you know, ownership of guns and other issues are also something to consider. So it's an open question. I don't know, Nicola, if you want to jump into.
Well, if I may, I think that is quite a concern. You see, COVID-19 for me, when we're discussing triggers, there are different types of conflict that could happen as a result of COVID-19. I am very concerned that in the States we had men with guns storming Michigan State House. I can imagine also here, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been flip-flopping. He hasn't been very clear with his instructions, and I think part of this is because he's worried about election, that's one, but also he is worried that unfortunately people are going to prioritize their so-called freedom over staying safe. It's not just about jobs here, but I do feel that there seems to be an attitude around, you know, we want to go out, we want to go out. People are not taking it seriously, and I think that part of that is how certain individuals interpret democracy, that political democracy is not the same as absolute freedom. And there are times when maybe, you know, as we've been discussing, should you give up a certain amount of freedom to stay safe? I'm not defending authoritarianism here, but I'm saying that, you know, governments that have taken a firm line vis-a-vis lockdown have had much lower numbers than in the US or in the UK, where we've been flip-flopping and people have not been obeying guidelines. And even our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, despite being diagnosed himself and having had treatment, seems to just not be able to give clear messages and to stay on point and to you know, firmly say we have to remain in lockdown. You know, they sent us letters saying you must stay at home, which I found very confusing, because you get this impression that in the UK at least, people are not always taking it seriously because they say to themselves, this violates my freedom. And the problem with that attitude is I do feel that it shows people are not always willing to concede when there's an issue. So coronavirus is a global problem, you know, and I think on top of that, that it shows that COVID can be a trigger, and it could also be a trigger for class upheaval. As of yesterday, a lot of people were kind of told to go back to work in the UK, and of course, those people who were forced to go back to work are working class. Middle class people are able to work from home. And so we have now also this classism coming to the fore. It's always been there, but we have that coming to the fore in the UK because of coronavirus in a way that perhaps it did not before.
I agree. Any other questions or points?
Hello?
Yes, sure.
Hi. Sorry, I joined the middle of the, Nikolai, your presentation. I'm sorry if I couldn't catch all. And then I was wondering, because I'm working in a, NGO, INGO now in Nepal with NGOs. So also I used to work with a Japanese government, NGOs, and also before was UNICEF. So I have very much interesting, experience, can compare about each actor's responsibility and rule. So now if we're talking about a COVID-19, I really wonder about that. Each country, is enough, a capacity to concern about our own country. But when I see that globally, in the future, for example, a EU or maybe UN, or whoever has a capacity support to the developing country, like Nepal, because Nepal is very much facing to difficulty now. Now it's almost 50 days lockdown, but since this Sunday, the people is start working with some condition by the government. But the reality was people sound forget about corona's infection. But the number of the newly found infected was dramatically increased for this week. So Nepali government is very weak, from my experience, to control this coronavirus. But I don't see the other country support to the Nepal now. The government is just request to the international NGO to, can you support, or we are ready to have a quick agreement with you for the responding of the corona. Only that what I found in Nepal. So I don't know other country, but when the globally is, a donor, developed country can ready to support the what can I say, developing country.
Well, I think that one of the things that we're seeing, unfortunately, with coronavirus is the return to locking down, quite literally, locking down borders, and that also means people are saying, you're on your own. I mean, look at what happened with Italy and the EU. Where was the EU at Italy's time of need? And this is, I think, an ongoing issue that really cracks are beginning to show, because we've never dealt with such a worldwide catastrophe before. We've never been, I think, in this situation. And I think social inequality is really going to be highlighted by this. Within Nepal, I would be curious what kind of orders the Nepalese government have issued. For example, what kind of lockdown they've had, and also how did people respond? Did people, if they ordered a lockdown, did people obey? I mean, look at Tunisia, for example. Tunisia is not a wealthy country, but they're close to zero. And they're close to zero because people, they did as they were told, basically, to put it very bluntly. They stayed at home, they maintained social distancing. And I think that goes to show that you may be able to attack or address the coronavirus without needing international aid per se. However, the problem we're going to have is the moment we lift the lockdown, a lot of people say that we're going to see cases rising again. We need a vaccine. The main thing that we would need from the international community isn't more money per se, it's a vaccine. And that's going to take time,
Well, especially at the beginning, the situation was so complicated and so difficult for all the countries that also, yes, the example of Italy, we had a little bit of a quarrel with Germany because they denied the export of the masks, if I remember rightly.
Or the ventilators even, I
The
think.
ventilators, yes. But from a certain point of view, even me, of course, being Italian, I don't think I can condemn that choice of Germany, because of course they were thinking about their own population, and also from another extreme, also Trump exactly happened exactly the same with he denied the exportation of in that case it was probably masks to European country. But can we really condemn these choices from the nation point of view? Of course, they gave priorities to the priority to their own population.
To argue that point, though, Trump not only did he deny the ventilators to other countries, he denied it to blue states. So he's that's an exception to the rule.
And don't get me started about European integration issues, because I don't know if you know or see if it's in my description, but I also have a postgraduate degree in European Union law, and it's also a passion for me in terms of research, so you would don't get me started. But what I think the issue is, Salvatore, it's actually not necessarily to do with the crisis itself. It's on the way the European integration process is flawed, and is flawed for some time, and which was also exponentiated by the financial crisis and the lack of solidarity mechanisms that were highlighted by it. And what I think, it's not, of course, when you think about it, and of course this is a very personal and biased approach, because I'm so fond and passionate about European integration process, its history, the key goals, that whenever, and I have, of course, family and friends in Italy and Spain, so when Italy and Spain were going through the hardship they were going through, I was not thinking, I wish there was for Portuguese people, and if I have to choose, I'll choose Portuguese. It's not the way I work, but I can, of course, understand the arguments of, being sure that, making sure for countries they have what they need for their citizens. So I think it's an issue that comes already from other issues and lack of solidarity in other spheres. But what I think the danger is from those approaches, even if you can understand them in principle, is to open a precedent in which then it will be really hard to go back to, in terms of this view that we really need to share. Because in the end, Germany ended up having really a low number of cases when compared to Italy and Spain, and they were able to respond with their own means to the intensive care patients they had. So was there really an issue to make sure that they would have this? And it was actually the same in Portugal. So for us, we struggled. There were the medical professionals were using perhaps the mask for many hours, and they shouldn't. But now everything is working. There are protection equipment for everybody. I think it's a matter also of adjustment and not being prepared. And I have family members working for the National Health Service, and what they say is really what would be the issue, even if we could not grasp something like this would happen. But for any case, to have, masks in stock beforehand, it was just also a matter of preparation. But on my view, I think the issue with saying, of course, we want it for our citizens, is the precedent that we open for nationalism, which I think, in my case, worries me a lot.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that this is the sad part of COVID-19, setting aside, of course, the deaths and whatnot, is it's starting to accomplish what the right wing across Europe wanted, which is the end of freedom of movement, the end of globalization. Are we seeing the end of globalization? And I think it also links to the idea of everyone for themselves. This is not how the globe is supposed to be. We all, many of us had assumed that we're becoming more connected, but when you have a situation like this, because COVID-19, I do believe it will eventually end, but it will not be the last global incident And the message it sends is that any global incident that rocks enough people, enough economies, you're on your own. And I think that's also going to feed into NGOs, because what's going to happen is, international NGOs may get their funding from several states, and if those states turn around and say, no, we need to focus on ourselves now, and that affects how those NGOs are able to help or not so-called developing countries, you're then feeding back into this loop of developing countries saying, well, we don't trust these NGOs because, first we didn't trust them because they were allied to Western states that are, neo-imperialist, for example, if I'm going back to the Middle East, but also where were they during the Corona crisis when we really would have needed them even more? The average person who looks to NGOs and wants help may or may not be aware of how funding works. They may or may not be aware of the fact that an NGO had their funding cut off because their client state or the Western states in question stopped the funding. So that will feed back into that issue of reputation and affect trust.
I agree. And in the case of Europe, some of the criticism that was appointed Salvatore's was then that the European External Action Service was allocating lots of funds and support to countries that were in, as they should. I'm saying they should, that were in precarious situations, so external to European Union, and then the mechanisms of solidarity within the Union were not working. And this, it's just, we have this approach of Europe fortress, and then being European as the bastion of democracy and all these things. But what about the relations among member states? And, that's something, I think I'll share it with you guys as an extra note in the announcements, but there's very interesting article in The Guardian, precisely, you might have read it, Nikolai, probably you did, about this being the last stone into the European project, and it certainly concerns me. And indeed, I'm also afraid of the same things as you, Nikolai. I'm not thinking about this crisis specifically. I'm thinking about different crises, and then that notion that from now on it will be your own. And it's exactly what we're just trying to, we all work in this field. And I think I can say we all have an approach which is focused on leaving no one behind, and common values, humanitarian values, and this core idea of humanity in the end. So, these are times where I think we should reflect a lot, and again, do what we can in terms of our work to promote this idea that we are better together, and indeed to try to avoid this imminent idea of even social conflict, which I worry about even in my country, that we'll have to face, I think, to one extent or another. So yeah.
No, I think
we are probably better together until a pandemic or an emergency of a global emergency like this, because I totally agree with the European situation at the beginning was really, I don't want to say mess, but very close. But if we see the same situation in the US, which is of course a union way older than the European Union, eventually that didn't change that much. They're still trying to favor their own state against the other states. So it's a complicated situation, of course.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, I have a last comment on that, we should work towards one thing, that the social distancing do not convert into permanent distancing, global distancing that you have mentioned. So again, the role of humanitarian actors is very important and vital here, that we have to play a role, because if this social distancing starting from one neighbor to another, if it increases or enhances the quantum of that, so you can well imagine what happens all over the world. It's like now we had moved beyond global, village or global, now towards universal families. So my concept of universal families, I can see is being, scattered or shattered somewhere during this pandemic. And I think it has to stay. Otherwise, if we are not family, the concept of family is that, if somebody is weak, if somebody is sick, if somebody is financially weak, so the other family members help them to come up and then to face those crises. But if we are not there for each other, so if you have seen the movie Time Machine, so if you go thousands of years ahead and see what happens, people are drowning and the others are just sitting and watching them, and they are not even feeling anything that somebody's drowning and we have to save them. And the books were like in the shelves, and the person just touched the book and it was all mud, and dust. So I think we are not heading towards that. We should learn from this pandemic that how to stay close. I'm not saying physically, but to stay close mentally or otherwise, to help each other to come out of this pandemic successfully. But at this stage, if we move on individualistic approaches as a country, as a nation, then I think globalization or universalism that we are talking about, it's gone. But again, the shoulders of humanitarian actors, they have this big burden rather than somebody else. Thank you.
Thank you, Farzana. And are there any last final, or last time pleonasm here, any final remarks? Otherwise, I would ask Nikolai to close the session with his final conclusions.
Well, I think going back to what Farzana was mentioning, I think that we also have to look at language. I mean, we're talking about social distancing. What we're really talking about, or should be talking about, is physical distancing. So in other words, keeping each other physically apart, but socially staying together. And I asked myself, if the EU, including the UK, had cooperated as one unit when coronavirus arrived, would we be looking at a different situation than we are now? If we had, if we had all cooperated and locked down at the same time and also said, okay, our numbers are low, we have respirators because we manufacture them, we'll send them to you, it would have been a very, very different scenario. And I think far fewer people would be scared. There would still be the issue of unemployment, but for all perhaps it would have been shorter term because numbers remained low, and perhaps also it would mean that the vaccine would arrive more quickly, who knows. So I think cooperation is key. We as human beings will not maximize our survival by being socially apart. We will maximize it by working together.